Postcards from a Dying World, the podcast. For more than a decade, I've reviewed over 1,000 books that are mostly science fiction, horror, and bizarro. This feed will feature bonus audio I have produced over the years, as well as a monthly digest of reviews based on what I've read each month, plus the occasional bonus material about my own fiction. Thanks for listening.
All right, joining me on the Postcards from a Dying World podcast is a very special guest and somebody I have known for decades. But Robert Pennington, who is better known in the tribe that I grew up in the hardcore music scene as probably as Rob Point or Rob by the Grace of God. He is also the vocalist recently of Black Cross. But we're going to talk later in the interview about some of the things he does professionally because it crosses the streams with what I do professionally for my day job. And because he is he's a PhD and BCBA in the Lake and Edward Snyder Distinguished Professor in Special Education at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte.
Ooh.
Got it. And but Rob, we're going to start talking about music, and because this is how we met each other. I grew up 2 hours north of you in Bloomington, Indiana. You grew up in Louisville. We shouldn't know each other except for the fact that we grew up in a very special and small tribe, which is the pre-internet hardcore music scene. And because of that, and I know I'm talking a lot, but I'm gonna let you take the reins here in a minute. But because of the way the hardcore scene worked before the internet, it was a very close, tight-knit scene, and the bands would travel and the hardcore kids would travel all over the Midwest to see shows. So I was constantly going to shows in Chicago, Louisville, Dayton, Ohio, Columbus. I had friends in all these places, Lafayette, Indiana, Indianapolis. And one of the bands that was consistently the soundtrack of my high school years, because you guys were playing almost all those shows all over the time, was Endpoint. And I've probably seen Endpoint live more than 100 times in my life. And that was your band. You were the vocalist of Endpoint. Can you tell me how you got into hardcore and what the punk rock scene was like in Louisville, which I know is a big question?
Yeah, I'll do it. I'll try to do it kind of quickly, I guess. I don't know. I think like most of us, we found our way into a community because I was a kid, and a suburban kid, I guess. My dad was dissatisfied with teaching and had just left teaching to start a bait business. They really loved fishing. And then my mom worked at Sears as a manager and worked really hard all the time. And I don't know. I just found myself not kind of fitting in with school. I was a little bit nerdy, so I was bully bait early on. And middle school was torturous for me, I remember. And then I kind of found this community, and I think I was prepped for it because there's an older guy, about 2 years older than I was, Myron Hardesty, who was our paperboy, and he had a mohawk and ride his bike around every now and then. He would listen to this, on a cassette tape, and I wasn't ready for it, but I'd be like, whoa, what is this, right? And so I found the few kids that were around that were into that. Somehow I gravitated towards hanging out with them, and they kind of gave me strength. And a lot of the music were narratives about being frustrated and fighting back against the norm. It kind of celebrated individuality, and I needed that at that time. And then once you get in the door, and if you like the music and there's wonderful people there's cool kids of all different ages, and you just kind of get wrapped in. And then the best part about it is, here I am, this kid from Kentucky, and I get to play in a band. I get to drive to other states, and then it took me to other countries. And I would have never had that opportunity without being in music. I wasn't a kid where my parents were going to send me to some Ivy League college, or some college really far away. Like, those experiences were kind of out of reach for me. So music really kind of opened the door for a whole bunch of other possibilities and activities. So that's how I got into it. The scene was great. As you know, you come to Louisville, Endpoint spawned a long period of time. I think we were together about 7 years. And so from the beginning of that show, of that time, when, there would be 100 people, to later, the shows were consistently 500 to 1,000 people. And so it was really strange to be a young nerd kid in the center of that type of scene, where there's like 500-800 people come to sing along to your songs. And I don't know, I look back now 30 years later, I'm like, wow, that was so exciting. I try to think about how it changed me. I think it gave me more confidence. I think it helped me interact with people. There were some hardships associated with it early on, but it was just a wonderful time. And Louisville's still a wonderful place. I'm not one of those guys that goes back and says, oh, it was the good old days. Like, there's still great stuff always happening there, and great iterations of bands, and it's just a cool town. We left it about 3 years ago, and I miss it a lot.
Well, I want to drill down a little bit on that, as far as, because this is my chance to ask you about this band that was a huge influence on me. And but Louisville, before we get into Louisville specifically, I know the first punk rock song, or first punk rock band I ever heard, was the Dead Kennedys, and it was like a lightning bolt. And I can remember very distinctly hearing Nazi punks fuck off for the first time, because I was like cracking up that they were cursing. Do you remember the first lightning bolt of punk rock? Was there a song or a band that just hit you the hardest the first, or is it an overall thing?
I don't remember the exact. I remember my first LP that I bought was Suicidal Tendencies, but I had a cassette tape, and I loved a Husker Du cassette tape, and I loved Flip Your Wig. Walking around with your head in the clouds makes no sense at all. And I that really spoke to me, because I was just so I don't know, I was really confused as a young person. I was just trying to figure out where I fit, and there were a lot of things going on in the home that were generally positive, but also, I think, stressful for me. And so I remember that a lot. And then I remember Black Flag, Depression, like hearing that on a cassette tape a guy gave me. And on one side was that, and then on the other side was Circle Jerks Group Sex. And it was like, that was it. I was just like, oh my God. Of course, like, the Black Flag side spoke to me, but then I couldn't stop singing along to Circle Jerk, because you're like, got a date, can't be late, don't show up, I'll masturbate, tell me what your problem, dun, dun, dun. And it was like, by the way, they just reissued that record, and my other one was so shredded, I ordered, I was so pumped. Yeah, so those two songs flipping back and forth were like the hooks for me, and then it was everything else. Descendants, like, I mean, all the bands that came along. Once you open that door, it becomes a swap meet of like, have you heard this? The people you meet, they expose you to more bands. But those are probably the ones that I remember the most. The early Husker Du, Damaged, Group Sex, and of course, once I bought that first Suicidal Tendencies record, I just wore it out. I remember my dad coming to the bedroom and going, "Do you want your mom dead?" And I was like, "No, Dad, it's just a song." It's like, "What's wrong with you?" So.
That's hilarious. Now, Louisville specifically has a very interesting scene, and I consider Endpoint being a part of that. As like, if you look at the history of the bands that came from there, from the very early days with like Squirrel Bait, and which the Squirrel Bait records are fantastic. I still listen to them all the time. Yeah. And you look at like King Horse as a band that came out of Louisville that was incredible, which, by the way, played the first show at Rhinos in Bloomington. The very first show at Rhinos was King Horse. So King Horse is also important to Bloomington as well. But yeah, I know the horse is very important to me too. But the thing with Louisville is that all the bands had a really interesting and sound there, and eventually there was somewhat of a Louisville sound with you guys and Falling Forward as far as hardcore goes, but it's just such an interesting scene. What was it like growing up, and specifically like hearing the local bands in Louisville when you were growing up?
Like many of those early scenes, I think it was, what was exciting for many of us is that it was kind of dangerous, right? Is that there was a posse hardcore around, right? There were bands that were scary, older bands, and we would see the Uninvited play, and kind of, well, there was an early band that I really loved, Solution Unknown, and they and members of that went on to Slint and other bands. there was Maurice, the Brain Dead. Anyway, I need to list off a bunch of bands, but there was a very kind of, and I don't know, I didn't grow up in other scenes, so but it was a very dark kind of scene. I think like it was really like hardcore, which I think spoke to that late 80s, mid 80s kind of sound. And it was just amazing. Again, as I told you, I was a middle class, kind of lower middle class kid from the suburbs. And I'd sneak out, go to this show where there's like older dudes in leather jackets, and there's this sense of adventure and this sense of rebellious. Again, I was a kid that was bullied in middle school, and I get to hang out with these like 16 and 17-year-olds that are older, that have leather jackets that are kind of scary. You know, you kind of find this level of confidence with them. So the scene itself was really enticing. Again, lots of small venues, Tooligans, Charlie's Pizzeria. There were some great VFW post shows. But you're right in terms of at that time, and I'm not a giant music aficionado. Like I have friends that can list off every band and every iteration, but to me it sounded very different. You know, it was hardcore, but it didn't sound like other hardcore bands. You know, if you listen to like Malignant Growth, like, you know, they were definitely influenced by, you hear like Minor Threat and stuff like that in there, but it didn't sound like it. Just the way their guitar sound, the way the singer sang, good old Brett Ralph sang. So there was a uniqueness, and I wonder if it's because people took snippets of things they liked from other scenes. Because, you know, Louisville is a weird place. It's like you've got the coast over here, definitely not the West Coast. Chicago's kind of close, and later there was a lot of Chicago influence in a lot of the music that came out of Louisville. But I think that maybe it's less of a direct influence of other coasts made some of the sounds and some of those bands to be pretty unique for their time. I might ramble a little bit. So
No, I want to hear it. But yeah, I think Louisville being not quite the North, not quite the South, being right in the middle. I know it felt like the South to you guys, being punk rock there. But one of the things, like in my novel Punk Rock Ghost Story, one of the major themes I wanted to explore was that I think that people who grew up in punk rock in the post-internet age have no idea how hated and despised and beat up and tortured we were before the internet came along and Nirvana made being different okay and mainstream.
no, we were angry. I mean, I know, and
Yeah.
it's not right. It's not. It's a sense of arrogance, and it's just stupid. But I remember just kind of being annoyed by Nirvana because I just suddenly felt, I was like, wait a minute, this is all cool now. And we had to suffer through being punched. You know, I tried to be on the wrestling team for a year or two because I don't know, I've always like martial arts, things like that. And the guys would just punch me in the back of the head. My teammates, they just hated me. I had skater bangs, like, you know, for many other reasons, but being 13 and 14 years old, you were just always called names. Every time, like, you're like, yes, fag. I mean, all those terrible words were thrown at you all the time. Like, and you're just like, so suddenly when those same people that tormented you suddenly started kind of dressing like us and listen to loud music, it was like, wait a minute. Again, it makes no sense as a grown up. It's like, yeah, everybody should be able to do what they have access to things that they enjoy. But again, we were angry because you're absolutely right. It was our nights look like this. We get in the car, we drive around, we try to find our people. You just try to find your tribe, right? And you're like, oh, they might be at the Vogue Theater. They might be in this park, mostly a parking lot scene where when there wasn't a show, we would find a parking lot. Cops would run off, we'd find another place. And it was, you know, it was problem solving. All right, where were they last time? You know, have you called? You don't have a cell phone, so you get on you try to catch somebody before they leave their house. You call from the payphone. Where are they? It was a totally different experience, I think, in terms of the response effort required to engage in that scene.
Yeah, well, in Bloomington, we had People's Park, which was the park that all the hippies, punks, freaks, and I actually just wrote a novel about People's Park, in part because the whole time we were hanging out in Bloomington and People's Park, we had no idea that the reason why the park existed was in the late 60s, there was a black-owned business there that had been bombed by the Klan, and the hippies of the day took over that place and said, we want to turn something positive out of this spot and made a park there. And we spent our whole youth hanging out in that park and had no idea the history of it, which is crazy. But yeah, Ryan Downey and I have talked about the places where you gathered before the internet as punk rockers. Because in Indianapolis, they had Broad Ripple, right? And we had People's Park. And in Chicago, they had Punkin' Donuts. And so I became really interested in like where in all these cities people like hung out. So you guys had to move around a bit where you chased out of spots? Is that was what was going on in Louisville?
Mostly, I mean, most of we spent, we were on Bardstown Road, right?
Yeah.
So Bardstown Road is kind of like the hit. Now there's multiple scenes in Louisville, little areas, but we would just move from parking lots to parking lots down Bardstown Road. So there's the Valvoline parking lot, the Deer Park parking lot. When we got kicked out of there, this cool minister across the street, it's like, oh, you can hang out in our parking lot. So we hung out there. Like it was, yeah. So we were definitely a parking lot scene. You know, one other thing is really that go back to shows that I think was really unique and wonderful about that time is the diversity of the people that went to shows, right? So first of all, the bands were different, right? Of course, it wasn't like a eight set hardcore band, you know, of like everything sounds exactly the same, like and I think that was really wonderful. It's also the scene was less segregated, like, you know, it was like there in the town there were like the five goth kids, the few hardcore kids, kids that were persecuted because they were gay or figured out who they were. Everybody just kind of came together in those early years. And that was really beautiful. And it was really disappointing, I think, or unfortunate that the popularity of the music grew so much that people were pushed out of that, and that there was so much segregation, I think, in scenes and how people felt that they belonged when they went to shows.
Yeah, that there became scenes within scenes. Yeah. Oh, totally. Yeah, it was not like that in the early days, and but with the early days of Endpoint, which I believe you guys were called Death Watch first, right? Was that the first
Yeah.
name? Like, all right, I got my trivia correct.
The
But
Duncan, the death, because he liked horror. That's like the Death Watch beetle that like knocks its head, and yeah.
yeah. So, of course, your partnership and longtime working relationship with Duncan, and for people who don't know, your guitar player for many, many years, Duncan Barlow, who might be familiar to many of the listeners of this podcast as the writer, as an author, who because I interviewed Duncan a couple before I officially did a podcast when I was just testing my waters at how to interview people and all that for his novel The City Awake, which is genius and brilliant piece of work. And but um, in the hardcore scene, there was a few partnerships that were kind of known, like Ray and Purcell, and like a singer and guitarist that worked together. And you and Duncan also did By the Grace of God together. Now you've both done bands on your own without each other, but you guys are like peanut butter and jelly as far as the hardcore scene. Like we kind of see you guys together, and your friendship and your partnership and your creative partnership working together is one that is enough that when you guys post pictures that you're just out, you're visiting each other and out for a hike, it just gives me joy to know that you guys are hanging out. Because I kind of, part of Endpoint is that relationship that you and Duncan had at the core of it. One of the reasons why By the Grace of God immediately I was like, all right, I'm getting that record, I'm going to go see that band, is because you guys were working together again, and I loved that.
Yeah.
How did you meet Duncan, and what was the creative spark that started Death Watch / Endpoint?
You know, for mine, we all have different memories on this, especially as we get older. But Duncan was already kind of established in the scene, right? He had an older sister. He was playing. He played Wolfsbane and then Crisis and some other. So he was already in bands playing shows, and so I kind of knew who he was. And actually, I saw Crisis play at the Brown School, and I can't remember. Maybe they were playing with Anti Youth and another band. But anyway, I remember he kicked me as a singer, and I was skanking around. I was like, "That guy's a jerk," and so, you know, he had like his motorcycle boots. He was probably like 14, you know, because I'm a year older. His little devil lock and this, and somehow through mutual friends and just being a part of, I don't know, we just kind of gravitated together, and we got close. And they were looking for, so the band brought us together really. So we knew each other. I remember we went to like a Beastie Boys Murphy's Law, Fishbone show together. I mean, we were kind of hanging out, but weren't super close yet. And then my other bass player, Jason Graff, in my previous band, he and Duncan were doing this band, and they reached out to me to sing for it. And then that's kind of where we came together. And, you know, Duncan, our relationship, we brought different things to the table. And I can definitely say that I'm just a better human for knowing him, you know. And again, we talk probably every other day, old men chatting about stuff. But you know, I love him dearly. He's probably he is my closest friend, and I'm glad that we had about 20 years. Well, you know, we still 2 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, we did a By the Grace of God tour, and we put out a new record. So I'm glad that we've had all these decades of adventures together. He's been a great partner in that.
Yeah,
and he's just a talented guy. You know?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, back in the day, my first ever hardcore show that I put on, you guys played at that show at Rhinos in Bloomington.
That's a great show.
That was a great show. It was Bloodline, Endpoint, Lifetime, and Resurrection.
Is that when I flipped out and got naked, or was that the second one?
No, this was the one where I got chewed out because of, I don't know if it was people that came from Louisville, or it was people were accused from Louisville of stealing the parking meters from the parking lot.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Right. But that was the first hardcore show I ever put on. And because when I booked it, I called Duncan, and we discovered that we both liked horror movies and horror fiction. And so I struck up a friendship with Duncan, and, regularly talked to Duncan on the phone, traded letters because this was pre-internet. And we would send each other flyers and stuff like that. So I'd say back in the day, I was closer, and I've always kind of known Duncan a little bit better. But one of the things about those times that's different from how things operate today is that you guys regularly played shows, Louisville, Indianapolis, Lafayette, Bloomington, Chicago, Dayton. The first time I ever saw Endpoint was at the New Space in Dayton, Columbus, and I went to all those shows. So it's not, we lived in different cities, but I felt like I saw you guys all the time. And, as it kind of felt, it was like a tribal feeling, like we were friends with all these guys. Like, I'll just pull a random person from, like Scotty Nemeth from Columbus, for example, just felt like one of my friends, because even though we didn't live in the same city, we saw each other on a regular basis. And that feeling and that emotional connection, not just with seeing friends from like, hey, we're all at the same shows. You'd pull up into, let's say you go to a show in Chicago, and you pull in the parking lot and you see, oh, there's so-and-so from Louisville, and there's so-and-so from Dayton. That's Frank McGuire there, blah, blah, blah. It was such a special time that, but what I think really kind of pulled it all together, and this is where I'm going to put some of this on you and Duncan and Chad and everybody who was in Endpoint at the time, was the emotional connection that Endpoint had with the audience in the Midwest was something that was very special. And Endpoint shows were like emotionally draining because they were outpourings of emotion from beginning to end. What can you tell me about how it felt for you to be at the center of this storm and because I can't listen to an Endpoint song now without still feeling a little bit of that emotional connection.
So, I wasn't aware at the time that's not true. I mean, I was aware at the time of the connection, because I was a part of it. Like, I felt just as connected to the shows, the people, and more importantly, the people at the shows. I think, sorry, I probably should have. That's a great question. So for me, one, I agree with you. It's hard to say that because I'm biased, because I was in the band, but I do think that going to millions of other shows, there was something special about those shows. I don't think that, it was it was planned. I think it was timing. I think there was a lot of honesty in us. I think we were okay sharing all of the everything, right? And like, I think I was a repressed kid. I think there was a lot of things I was trying to work out. So I was okay doing that in front of people. And then I also suffered from some depression and all that. I was able to turn inward on stage, and it was very cathartic for me. I've always been that way. Like, you ask me, my friends, I did martial arts for 20 years. We didn't wear gloves. I just got beat up a lot. Like, like, I always like working through stuff. And I still am, I think, try to be full tilt in many of the things that I do. So one, I don't think that we plan to do it. I recognize that it happened, and acknowledge that it was extremely special. And I'll watch one of those old videos, and I sometimes, if it's the right moment, a little hair stands up my arm. So I remember that show and that moment and those people, and like, and it, I would weep. It was weird, but I felt it. I felt connected to it. So what it was like to be a part of it. So one, it was exciting at some points, because everybody wants to feel special. And when people come to your shows, you're like, oh, that's awesome. But it was also really troubling, right? Because you felt that we became so connected with the people we played for, because suddenly they were our friends and family, that you felt you couldn't let them down, or sometimes we were letting them down if we didn't do something right. I don't think I was equipped sometimes. I was this I tried to be a good listener. So like, we'd have a show and people are lined up to hug you after the show, and then you're sitting down in the corner, you're talking to them about things that you're not equipped to talk to them about, but you try to listen, and some were intense. People talked about, things would come up, right? So people would talk about abuse. Women would talk to me about sexual abuse. Everything from, I went through a cache of letters one time, and it was everything. It was everything from, I had letters about date rape. I had letters about kids being bullied in school because they were vegetarian. It was just the weirdest, and to look back on that now and to think I was like, 17 through 22 trying to respond to that or be an effective communicator. It was stressful, I think.
Yeah. Well, and I can tell you too that I have a very specific example of the first Indianapolis Fest, the one at the Knights of Columbus, right?
Yeah.
You guys played at the end of the fest, and I remember because I was really good friends with the Abnegation guys at that point, and Abnegation had this like crazy set that turned into people yelling and screaming at each other, and I remember saying before you guys came on, I was like, I don't have the emotional bandwidth to take Endpoint right now. Like, I remember saying to a friend, I'm not even gonna watch Endpoint. And I think you guys opened with the Force Fed or whatever you guys were playing, and the first song I was outside and I was just kind of like, oh, whatever. And then you guys started playing Cast, and then my body took over. And then the next thing I know, I'm like falling on the stage. Duncan steps on me. I'm thrown back into the crowd. And I was just like, I remember having this thought of like that first song. I was like, I'm not even going to watch Endpoint right now. And then realizing that I had no control over myself at that point. The Endpoint was such a part of me that like, even when I tried to resist it, I couldn't. So it's a funny thing about that band. But one thing that I think is cool about Endpoint is we kind of got to watch you guys, and this is true of any hardcore band. If you take Earth Crisis or any band that was together for a long time, you can watch the band grow up in front of your eyes and like look at the music and how it changes from. And we had a little bit of dogfight back there, but you can. I mean, and some of the early Endpoint stuff to me, and don't take this the wrong way, because I love it. But some of the songs are so goofy and hilarious that, in a great way, like "Thought You Were," I cannot not listen to that song and crack up with the Use Unity. Like, I love it, but it's still in my shuffle. I listen to that all the time. There's other songs I think are stronger from early on, like "Way Back." I think is still a great song, for example.
That was our drummer Rusty wrote that song.
Yeah, that is a great song. And sorry, a little dog growling. But so you got that, but and I'll never not laugh at I'm so fucking pissed in the model, right? So
But we played a show in Chicago maybe 10 years ago, 8 years ago, and it was all of us. It was basically by the grace of God playing Endpoint songs. So it was me and Duncan and Tommy and Robbie Scott, and we all went and got SFP tattoos afterwards. So fucking pissed tattoos with a little arrow through them. It was pretty.
that's great.
No, I will say I felt, I feel that. I feel that is one thing that was cool about that band, is because we were all just goofy kids together, even a part of the scene. The scene watched us grow up, and I felt that. I felt like there wasn't as many phases. I felt like a lot of people were with us through the whole generation. They grew with us. So as we got better and more sophisticated in what we're writing, they were all growing up and having their lives too. And it was really cool for that not symmetry, but just that kind of alignment with people's lives. And so I think that was another thing that contributed to the connection of Endpoint.
Well, and one thing that I think is neat when I look at the music that you produced is like I can look at Aftertaste and say musically you're doing far more mature and interesting things than for example Catharsis. But Catharsis to me is peak Endpoint because it's where you just totally nailed what Endpoint was. And I know I've said this to Duncan before that even though I think Aftertaste probably has better music on it, I think Catharsis is if somebody asks me what is Endpoint, like, wants me to distill Endpoint for them, I'm going to play them Catharsis. And that's the record that I think you guys nailed what you were as a band. And also those shows around that time is, I think, the perfect where it was starting to get big, but it wasn't too big. And it was still kind of our secret, kind of, so I don't know how you feel about that, but.
The breaking point was this. We played someplace in Chicago. It was really small, wasn't well attended. It was an art studio. There was Pyramid in the name of it, maybe. And that was it. We were playing Catharsis songs. We had all just been dumped, maybe, and we were all just like in the prime of like the amalgam of shit that goes on growing up, and we were just depressed. We lost it. Like that show. All the other shows before that were just kind of like, if you look back at the Time of the Hate era, we were trying to emulate our hero, trying to figure things out. But that show, like Chad lost his mind, like just we broke everything, and from then on it was like we didn't go back. We're like, this feels good. And from then on it was just all honesty. We just kind of did ourselves. But it was that night in Chicago at some weird place called the Pyramid something. It was a art studio. And then, so I agree with you. Those songs like Iceberg and some of those songs to me are like still some of my favorites to play. I mean, they're not lyrically sophisticated either, but they were honest, and they really were in accordance with what was happening at the time for me.
Yeah. It's totally an amazing record, and still totally holds up in my opinion. So then you did By the Grace of God, and that was more kind of traditional hardcore, and you could tell that this was done by kind of grown-ups who knew what they were wanting to do, and it's really great stuff. I love both the original By the Grace of God records. I mean, I like the stuff you put out recently too, but what it's a very assured thing. Like it's a very confident thing. It's by people who know what they're doing and setting out to do it. And so I do really appreciate that aspect of By the Grace of God. But what I liked, looking about, well, I guess I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. So it seemed like By the Grace of God was you guys trying to say like, hey, we still love this. We still love hardcore. We want to do a hardcore band, and we want to do a hardcore band, but do it, knowing what we're doing this time a little bit better. Am I wrong? Was that the motivation?
That was exactly the discussion that we had. We saw other bands out there playing. There were a lot of bands that there was a shift towards this non-personal kind of, I don't know, boys club, weird hardcore kind of thing. It seemed like maybe I don't. Anyway, we said, yeah, we can do this. Let's just do a straight up hardcore band. And we wanted you, and even though there are some personal songs on with By the Grace of God, we saw it as a vehicle for some messaging, right? So one of them was directly targeted at what we thought was happening with that hardcore scene that we loved, but also it gave us room to talk about other specific issues that were of interest to us at that time. So yeah, I think it was much more on the nose when it came to talking about corporations, talking about, you started seeing special education for me making its way into those lyrics. And so yeah, it was a very different, much more comfortable. We were done blowing ourselves up to figure out who we were. We kind of, we were in our mid-20s now. We were starting to figure stuff out. So
right. And you guys were already you and Duncan were already in school and working towards like professional careers, and so I think that's reflected in that too. It's funny because I was talking to an old hardcore friend from here in San Diego a couple days ago, and he said to me, and this is my kind of rough transition to the second part of what we're going to be talking about, but he said, of course, it's two guys in Endpoint that ended up professors. And I was like, what's that supposed to mean? And he was like, well, they were figuring themselves out, right? And I said, yeah. And he's like, well, they were always real smart guys. And I was like, well, yeah. It's like, they're smart dudes in lots of hardcore bands, though. And we just had this funny conversation. And then I said, well, I think specifically with what you do, Rob, because I know, because I'm in the same field with special education, hardcore teaches us to think differently and think outside the box. And I hate that phrase, but because it's so corny, but it's true. And a lot of times with special education, we're having to think on our feet, especially my absolute favorite aspect of working in special education. And I know this sounds weird to other people, but my favorite days in this field are when I have a kid with autism who's tantruming, who's losing their mind, and I have to figure out the puzzle of how I'm going to calm them down and how I'm going to get them back to baseline, right? And figuring out that puzzle of, okay, what's my antecedent? What started this? How am I going to calm them down? Is something that I think comes naturally to me, partially because I grew up thinking about the world differently. What says you, Rob? And how did you get involved with special education? Where did that start for you?
Two different questions. So the first one, I was a peer tutor in 5th grade. And so I was fortunate. I got an advanced program, maybe in 4th grade, and like did some special things we could do. And one of them was, we finished some work, we'd go next door and work in a special education classroom and had students with more severe disabilities. And so that's where I figured it out. My dad was a teacher. He told me not to teach towards the end because he had left, and I was like, screw you, Dad, I'm going to teach anyway. Like a rebellious punk kid, I guess. I don't know. I just knew it was an option. I was in Future Teachers of America in high school. I was doing, during the Endpoint days, I was doing respite, and I did home therapy a little bit. Like I already knew what I wanted to do, and I started teaching by 22. So that was it. I was fortunate. I knew something that I wanted to do. Its alignment with punk values, I think, is, you can always make connections, but I do think I think that there is a social justice aspect, right, of good punk. And I think that you want to do something where you feel like you're making a difference, right? So I think that's important. I think that, I spent the first, 8 decade of punk rock trying to problem solve and figure things out, and that's, like you said, in special education, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to build equity for persons with disabilities, which still we have obviously discussed, we're obviously always working towards inclusion, but and support of underrepresented folks, but still we're really far behind in terms of supporting people with disabilities, in terms of the access they get, the post-secondary outcomes, inclusion, So there's a lot of work to do. So there's a lot, so it's a good place to go out and do the work of problem solving. So I think that's important. I also think that there's maybe, I don't know, maybe there is some sense of empathy, right? We understand that many of us grew up in this place where the world didn't seem to be working for us. And I think a lot of students with disabilities, we always like to, uh, we don't like to, but people have this kind of deficit model of, oh, this person has such a disability, instead of viewing that, we just haven't figured out how to make the world a better place for everyone, including persons with disabilities. So, moving away from this. So I was taught early on through punk rock to not look at deficit models, but look at people's strengths and celebrate those things that might be a little weird, a little different. And so I think that's, in alignment with what we hope we're doing in special education. So yeah, there's some connections for sure.
Yeah, and I one thing I forgot about, one of the reasons why Duncan and I kind of bonded back in the day is that we're both extremely dyslexic and both struggled with dyslexia. And I think one of the reasons why he and I bonded together on a lot of that is that we had very specific um, conversations early on about like what we were having to deal with at school because of our learning disabilities. And I think specifically that interface with my own disability kind of got me wanting to think, like, what's a job that I can do where I can help other people and who have it worse than I do, or have more struggles, or more, I shouldn't say worse, but have more struggles, and so and I started the same path. I never actually became a teacher, but I've always been a para, but um, I started with working in group homes and doing respite care and doing all that. And I still, kind of moonlight here and there doing that if I need to. But, it was always exciting to me to learn that there was a bunch of us who came from the hardcore scene that got into this field. I see people all the time, like Ryan Canavan, for example. Ryan Hanging Like Hex, who's been doing this too. And I know Ryan from when I lived in Syracuse, and he's been doing this forever too. And he and I have had lots of conversations over the years about working in this field. And it was always cool to us to know that you, as somebody we looked up to as the singer of Endpoint, was doing this. But it's a whole nother step to get to get your PhD and to teach special educators at the college level. Why did you decide to take that path?
Um, so so first, just a quick course correction. I want to say that one, well, and you probably didn't imply this, but as you're talking about, like, well, I didn't go do these things. It's like people intersect, no matter what position you hold, people have a lot of power to improve lives for folks, right? And so you just do it in different ways. And so
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of people that are certified teachers that are doing a very poor job, right? And then I see paraprofessionals that are just killing it out there and making the world a better place. And same thing for me. It's like I have a job, but I am day to day not working with people with disabilities anymore, even though I pride myself on still getting out in classrooms. I do free consultations. I do studies in classrooms. Like, that's what I like to do because I don't want to lose touch. But I think that, so I decided to do it because the environment, this is going to sound very behavioral, but the environment kind of shaped me that way. So I started teaching. I realized I didn't have the skills that I had. I started getting better, but then I was I'll do this very quickly. I was offered a position to pilot an inclusion program for kids with autism. So I left my classroom. I did that. It was really hard because I was good with kids, but my job in this position was to change teachers' behavior. And so it was like, oh God, they just wanted me to come in, take the kid out. I was like, well, that's not what I'm here for. And it was just really a difficult situation because I was trying to please parents, have good outcomes, help, please the district and the teachers. And there was the position was actually developed kind of to eliminate lawsuits that were happening. So I was this young upper 20 something, like, all right. And then it's like, whoa, this stressful environment. So I went back to teaching young kids. I moved to Colorado, and that's where I moved in with Duncan. Duncan was in school there at the time. And Christian Olsen, his wife, had a little house, fun times. and taught young kids again because I knew a lot more. So it was kind of great to get all this training and working with adults and go back and have my own kids and work in that context for a bit. So then I came back to Kentucky, went to a district position, and because I had developed some more skills, I feel like my caseload was increasing. Like one time I had 78 kids that I was supposed to be keeping my eye on in a large district of 150,000 kids with all different teachers. And so basically I was starting to be rendered incompetent and I was nervous. I was like, I don't want to not be good at my job, but basically my job now is to show up, check off a box and be like, okay, I got here, right? Because you can't go 3 times in a week to the same teacher to help change their behavior and coach them. And so it was serendipity. I had this phone call from a professor at University of Kentucky. Had some familiarity with me, and they were recruiting for a fellowship and asked if I wanted to apply. I went in, did the whole, I hadn't worn a tie in a while, was all dressed up and did the rounds with all the professors. And I was selected for that fellowship along with a small cohort of other people. So it was paid for through a federal project grant. And then I just loved it. I loved it. Suddenly I'd had enough experience realizing that I was, just above mediocre probably because the things I didn't know. And so then I was like, oh, I can do this, or I can do this. And then you had access to do this. And then when I got my first faculty job, I enjoy writing, I enjoy doing research, and I enjoy helping teachers be effective. And I train behavior analysts too. So I teach in both those programs. And so it's just really fun to prepare people to kind of instill in them things that I think is really important. I tell teachers, I teach a communication methods course for kids that have minimal, we call complex communication needs. So I will say, I'll say them up front. I'm like, if you have a kid in your classroom under your care that can't basically make simple requests or tell somebody to stop touching them, then we're failing. You're not worth your salt. Those strategies are not that hard to teach, but it means you're focused on something else. So anyway, I get to kind of distill some of those values, I think, in the teachers that I work with. And so it's still reinforcing to me. Still, there's always new questions. I have wonderful colleagues. I work a lot more than I did even as a teacher, I think, because when you're in a research position of faculty, you're just always going. But to answer your question, why I'm doing it now is because I really love it. And I also acknowledge I had a level of privilege to be able to have an access to a PhD program. Not everyone can do that. Not everyone actually finds their way into some grant funded project. But it's exciting work. It really is. It's really, really fun. I get to travel. We don't get to tour as much. So now I get to go to a conference. Someone asks me to come speak. And I'm like, oh, what vegan restaurants are there? Or where is it? Let's take a look.
We're coming back to that because I can't not talk about vegan restaurants.
So it's full of reinforcers. And every now and then I get to connect with people. Yeah, it's like, Black Cross, first record was on Equal Vision. And through that, I met this wonderful guy, Dan Sanshaw. And then I was at the big ABA conference. And I was like, wait a minute, that's Dan's wife. So Jen Sanshaw is a behavior analyst. And you're right. I go to these conferences and I meet all these kids that what's scary is a lot of them are younger than I am now. I'm like, oh, tattooed kids that are punk rockers or singing bands. I'm like, whoa, check it out. Like it's really Matt Tincani. Great guy, respect him. He was in academia before I was reading his papers in my doctoral program. He played guitar for Edgewise. I mean, it's just like, it's full of crazy people all the time.
Wow, that's crazy. Wow, I didn't know that about Edgewise. One of the most notorious Louisville shows that I can ever remember was Judge Integrity, Endpoint, and Edgewise, right? I've had that flyer on my wall for 20 years. Yeah. Oh my gosh, that's crazy. Well, yeah, and the thing about it is that in this field, when you're a teacher or para, like on the ground, right? And as I'm wearing a Star Trek shirt, I'm going to make a Star Trek analogy. In Star Trek, there's always like when Kirk has to deal with the admiral who comes in, he doesn't know what's going on, and and a lot of times when we get experts or people from the district or whatever that come in, it's really hard. So when somebody comes in who actually knows their stuff and can really add to it, you really love those experts, and we make a point of when we have somebody come in that has really great feedback to make sure to tell our BCBA, like, hey, that person had great feedback. They were really awesome. We want them coming back, and because it's hard for you guys when you come into a classroom and you see one day or you see a couple hours, you read some data to try and figure out what it is. But I think you can always tell the people who have a natural feeling for teaching because they can look at the data, they can look at what's going on in a classroom in one day and translate your experience and know it. And you gotta, when you get somebody like that comes in, it's really, really exciting because you can tell the ones that, like you said, that try to keep your foot in the classroom and try to do that. You can really tell the difference. I'm just saying that on my end as someone who's been a para for 20 years, right? And anyways, that's a lot of talk. But I really appreciate that. It was really cool to me as somebody who grew up listening to Endpoint that, like, oh man, Rob's a BCBA. That's freaking awesome. Like he's in it, and so it's really funny to me because there have been a couple times over the years when I've had a particularly bad student where just in the back of my mind, I thought to myself, you know what? I should send Rob an email. But I can't because it's like, confidentiality. You can't do that, And I'm like, maybe I won't use names. But it's just so cool to me that you're in this field, that you know this stuff, that you've worked with this stuff. And it's just something that I really, really, really appreciate. But so one other thing I want to talk to you about with working with kids with disabilities is how do you think the people who are new to the field, like I have to train a lot of new paras that come in. That's part of my job as somebody who's experienced staff. I've been at the school that I've been at for 5 years. And a lot of times we're hiring people that have very little experience or just a little experience. Sometimes maybe they have family experience in their family. Like, how do you explain the mission of working with people with disabilities? Like, how do you reach out to the people who are new?
That's an extremely broad question.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I know. So one, I think obviously you want to make sure technically that you train them for the skills that they will need to do a specific job, right? So it's going to be different for people in all different positions. You work with somebody in employment, you work with young kids with autism, you're really going to make sure that you're catering what you're training to them to make sure that it's effective for that population. So sometimes we do this big, omnibus training, you gotta have to have everything. And I just don't know if that's always realistic. I do think that it's really important to I think one of the most important elements is make sure things are person-centered and really tackle the idea that you want to make that, and I mentioned a little bit earlier, that we're not trying to, work with this poor child with this disability. The idea is that we're here to help this individual or support this individual to access what everyone else has, right? And the opportunities that everyone has. And I think that's really important. I think that sometimes we, I remember being a teacher and I have kids on the bus, we'd be traveling and, somebody would always be like, God bless your heart for working with these kids, and you're like, oh God, they're like, thank you for you doing it, not me doing it. But the idea is that coming from this person-centered place, that these are individuals that have the same rights as everyone else. But they're not afforded to those because of some unique qualities or skills that they have or don't have. And so our idea is to build a network of support so they have increased access. I also like that, for people to play the applicable card. Like, I don't know if that's a great word, but I think another big core idea is that we are always targeting interventions that are doable and will be useful when we're not there. So again, a paraprofessional, I'll say to them, it's like, they don't need a friend. And it's nice if you like them, that's great. But they basically need somebody that's going to help them, give them supports. Because, we don't need to be on the cross, like, oh, we're the person that can help this individual. We need to put naturalistic as much as possible, teach them to a level of independent performance and provide, kind of natural supports so that they'll be able to, survive, be successful and happy the rest of their lives without us. So, I'll see people that will do something, provide so many layers of support. And they're like, yes, we're moving the kid forward. Things are happening for him. But then you think about, well, what if that person's gone? So really being really smart about you. And sometimes it is just common sense. We get lost in the weeds with technicality. We're looking at curriculum. This has to be taught. And I ask people to sit back and be like, does it really? If you have, when somebody at a young age, there's kind of this developmental bent, right, where something doesn't happen, and maybe there's the intellectual disability, or the number of skills that you have to catch up that have to be taught, expand greatly, because you and I acquire most of what we know through watching others, learning rules, all these things, and generalizing skills. Whereas a lot of our students don't, right? And so suddenly that curriculum is like this. So you gotta be really smart about, like, what are you gonna teach that's gonna help this person basically access more reinforcers and avoid situations that are punishing and not pleasant for them. And that's really what should drive it. So, I mean, those are kind of big things. Of course, we could spend forever talking in the weeds about what are the most important skills to teach. But, just recognizing the people you're working with are people, and you're not their. There's a disconnect between what they're able to do in the environment. So your job is to fill that in by giving them more skills or adjusting that environment. And then you're doing it within environments that they're actually going to live in. I remember my first year teaching, I was in an urban community with kids that mostly did not have a lot of financial resources. I was like, I'm going to take them on a trips, and we'll go to like Indian food, and we'll do all these crazy things. So I thought it was cool from this like savior perspective to expose them to all these things. And then I realized, like, what am I doing? I remember I took them all camping. I was trying to get the permissions in. I hunted down this parent. I was like, why don't you want to go? He's like, Brother Rob, I got to tell you something. He said, he was like, and this is a broad stereotype, and I don't know if there's any validity or not, but he said, he was a Black man, and he said, Black people don't like camping. What are you trying to do? Drag our kids out into the woods? That's why nobody's responding to you. And I'm like, oh, so I didn't ask. I didn't say, what do you want your kids to know how to do? I was like, this will be great for them. Again, stupid, right. Just out of school, like thinking I knew anything when I knew nothing. And so again, also making sure that you listen to the families and your clients. And they don't want to they want to learn something, that's their right. There's a great paper about, I forgot the exact title of it, but it was about the right to eat donuts and take a nap.
Right.
Famous ABA paper, and God, I can't believe the author's not coming to my mind. Usually I'm pretty nerdy about that, but Bannerman, that's it. If you haven't read it, Bannerman, Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, the right to eat donuts and take a nap. It's an amazing paper.
Well, it's my stepmother's influence on me in the field is she's a researcher she's retired now from Indiana University School of Ed, and her main field was parent teacher collaboration. So I'm the annoying one in all the meetings at our school who's always like, well, this is what the parents are feeling, or like, have you thought about it from the parents' perspective? I'm always the one that's and we have one particular student in my class right now whose mother is a BCBA, and once we started doing Zooms, like now she like only wants her son to work with me because like she figured out that I'm like king of parent teacher collaboration, whatever. And I know she like read a paper of my stepmother's, but to me, it's so important to look and say like, hey, you've got a shot here with these kids, and the parents are trusting you with the time. You have to try and think about what the parents want. I'm not saying you always agree with them, right? Because some parents are overwhelmed at home, and you have an opportunity, because you only have 4 to 6 hours a day. You can be stricter, and you can be tougher, you can be more in line in that time than they can 24 hours a day. and they're counting on you. They're counting on you to do more with the time that you have than they're able to do in 24 hours of the day. And so that is my philosophy all the time. I'm I'm
But
well known for bringing this up in meetings with my with this.
because what educator would you ask and say, our family's viewpoints important? They'll say yes, but
Right.
they just don't have time. They forget about it. They try to move through quickly. So they need a stimulus like you, a prompt to be like, wait a minute, everybody needs you in their team meetings, because again, we overlook it way too often. And again, it's not because of intent. People, the majority of things we do, we don't consciously make some decision. I'm going to do this. We just leave parents out because we think it's more efficient. And
Yeah.
usually it results in less effective programming down the road.
Well, and you see it when how the teachers, a lot of times, the teachers who are not so great, how they prepare for IEPs, because they almost see it as like a match against the parents instead of looking at it as a collaboration. And I can tell as a para, 5 minutes into working in a classroom, if you have a conversation with any teacher about they're because they're always planning for an upcoming IEP, right? And so if you as a para, I come into a classroom and I ask a teacher like, "Oh, whose IEP are you working on?" And if they talk about it for just a minute, I can tell whether they're thinking about the parents or not. And I have had a lot of I've moved around a lot in the school that I work in with different teachers, and if I feel like a teacher is not on the same page with me, I'll find a way to get to another classroom. But that's just me. But I don't like to waste my time either. I like to really be able to affect my students too. And I've never become a teacher for the specific reason that my writing career is something that I was hoping will still take off at some point, because at the end of the day, I wanted to be able to, when I clock out as a para, to not have to think about it the rest of the day. And I know if I was the teacher, I would never stop thinking about it. So that's why I've never pursued that. However, I respect you guys. I respect you teachers a lot. I love when I find a good teacher to work with. So that being said, do you have anything else on the ABA trade before we get into traveling and vegan restaurants? And like, I just put it out there to people that working in applied behavior analysis is awesome, and doing, you know, I only have my RBT and I do ABA after school with some of my kids, and I tell people all the time that there's a very specific thing once you train yourself to work in applied behavior analysis where it affects how you deal with your dogs. It affects how you deal with your loved ones, and you watch how the antecedents feed everything, and it actually does change everything and how you see things.
I will say this because maybe your listeners don't. We've used a lot of jargon, right, today. So just so you guys know, so applied behavior analysis is a science of human behavior, right? And it's been
Okay, yeah, I should have said.
over almost a century now. We've been conducting studies in human behavior, and so it's probably one of the most what we call evidence-based approaches to addressing behavior. And here's another thing. So we've talked about disability and application to teaching, addressing problem behavior. Again, it's probably the most sought after, most effective practice. Well, within its practices based on ABA, it's probably the most effective in terms of helping students with problem behavior. But I mean, we see it everywhere, right? We see it in business. We see it in the medical field. I'm a part of a couple organizations where behavior analysis is broad. And what I love about it for me is behavior analysis, because it's really about people. It's about the effect of the environment. So most people's skills that they have, right, are rooted in, I'm doing this for your listeners, are rooted in their learning experiences. So from that perspective, there's no such thing as a broken person or a bad person. It's just a person that has a particular set of behaviors that their environment shaped for them, right? And so for me as a person, it makes me more forgiving. It makes me a better problem solver. It makes me understand why that guy flicked me off, or that jerk down the street, tried to bully me. I feel more sorry. Instead of being a dick, I'm like, man, that guy must have had a terrible set of terrible learning history. Bummer, right? So.
And I wonder if you've had this experience, because as a hardcore kid specifically in this, I used to work at a different school in San Diego that we dealt with a lot more of the aggression and the violent episodes. I'm proud to say that the school I work at now, we have very few aggressive episodes because I believe, because of the way our philosophy works, we don't do battles with kids, like, very specifically. But at this old school that I worked at, we used to have violent episodes all the time, and I was known for being extremely calm while getting hit, punched, spit, beat on. And people would always say to me, like, they would ask me, like, how I could stay so calm when things were getting, and I was like, do you know how many Earth Crisis mosh pits I have survived? How many times I've been hit in the face, like, by random things, had a stage diver kick me in the back of the head, microphones swung in my face. Like, because of punk rock, I think I can handle all those moments and stay completely calm. And a lot of times I get recruited into these violent situations when they do happen because of how calm I can stay. Have you had the same experience? You're nodding a lot, so I think you have.
Definitely. So there's two things. One, kind of how quickly you get over it. I think, it's based on your learning history. Like, oh, the kid's not trying to get me, whatever. There is a certain level of what we call like respondent conditioning, where, if somebody throws a punch at you, no matter how well you understand why it happens, you react. Basically, that's wired in us through evolution. But people that have had lots of exposure to things like mosh pits, like I said, I did martial arts for so long. No kid can hit me as hard as I've been hit by my grandmasters and masters before. So, I'm a little bit more, nobody likes it, but if a kid hits me, I don't get angry. I'm like, okay, so it gives me opportunities. Since that, I don't get so aroused and escalate so quickly, it's easy for me to think, okay, what I need to do next. And I think the people that have that skill set or some of that experience are probably a little bit better in those really dangerous situations, for sure.
All right, so now the fun part, the food, because Rob, like, one of the reasons why you're such a joy for me to follow on Facebook, especially when you're traveling, is because you, I think, do things exactly how I do when I travel, which is the first thing I do is I look at Happy Cow and I see where I'm eating and I plan out my trip, because I like eating at random, new, interesting places. And as a longtime vegan, like, just finding those kind of gems. And because touring with bands, and you did a lot more as a musician, I just lugged equipment for people. Uh, but when you were touring, you found all these places like your Soul Veggies, just places like that. What are your favorite, like, off the top of your head, what cities are your favorite to eat in, and what are your favorite places to eat? Oh, you're really thinking about this one, I can tell.
It's really overwhelming to even say that. So what I do, one, I still like to go back to New York, and I'll tell you why. There's so many new restaurants, it's like, since everything's moved to Brooklyn and other places, like, there's just good food to eat. But I still go back to those early Endpoint experiences of, back then it was like cardboard Nature's Burger or falafel, and then like, so now it's like, I remember the first time going to House of Vegetarian and being like, oh my God, hot steak. So it recently closed down, and I shed a little tear. But
the 15 spare ribs there were amazing. Yeah.
But around the corner, they still have the vegetarian dim sum house, which is owned by the same people, and they have the same hot steak. So hot steak, brown rice, and a Coke is, to me, one of the most delicious things I've had. It's gross, kind of. It's like chewy and whatever, but and then I love going to. So I'm more of a creature of habit. So I'll go to Bots and I get big giant New York bagel, spoonful of tofu sun-dried tomato cream cheese, and you eat it just like squirt on the side of your face. I'm sitting there just looking at pigeons, thinking about BF Skinner, eating my thing. Like, it's just the best in the world. So that off the table, I like to go some pretty, that new people be like, why do you eat there? It's like, because I remember.
When you come here, you're probably going to want to eat a Pokies then.
Okay.
Yeah. You remember Pokies?
Mexican restaurant?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, that was good. That nice flaky tortilla crust. Anyway, so like I love speaking in Houston, and maybe like 5 minutes from the speaking venue is an old school Govinda's, And it's like, it reminds me of the 80s, like Hare Krishna hardcore. So I'll go in there and they're almost the whole buffet is vegan. I'm like, this is awesome. And yeah, it's okay. There's better Indian food, but like, it's just the smells, the whole like memory of it. That being more recently, there's a million places to go. It's almost overwhelming. I love going up to Asheville, which is only now less than 2 hours from me. And they've got Plant, which is like ranked one of the top national vegan restaurants, is really good. They have a great kind of Rosetta's Kitchen, which is, full of kind of like DIY punks running behind it. And they have amazing like greens and cornbread and they have the best cheesecake. Like, I'm not a huge vegan cheesecake friend, but the way they are a fan, but they have this delicious cheesecake that's just, I don't even know how to explain how good it is. And also, if you go to the little food co-op there, you get to see Bobby Sullivan, who works who I think manages it there. So there's all sorts of cool stuff about being near Asheville. There's a Blue Dream Curry House, which is really good. They make, they have the Smiling Hara Tempeh, where they make their own tempeh in Asheville. Like, it's just a bunch of so that's really cool. I like going to, I like doing a little food truck circuit when I go to Austin now. They have like this great barbecue revolution truck where it's just like old school, like a piece of white bread, barbecue brisket, like all sorts of gross sides that have no green color in them all. And you're just like, this is still really good,
Yeah. Well, and then there's just some places like legendary places that have closed that make me really sad. My friend had the last meal at the Globe in Seattle. He literally ate the last meal before they closed. He was sitting there when the guy said, "That's it, we're done." They were supposed to be open for a couple more days. And he said, "When you guys are done, we're locking up." And my friend Paul was like, "I just had the last pancakes at the Globe. It's amazing."
So for my Midwest friends, Louisville has always had some good spots, but it is just now like,
yeah, I've heard. Yeah.
Grits. Oh my God. Like, so Grits, one has like, I like to drink beer with it once in a while with dinner. So it has their own little brewery, and a part of the proceeds go towards animal rescue. And then it has like this like beautiful vegan.
Oop. Oh shoot, we froze.
Cuisine. There's within a little block, there are bakeries, restaurants, and then it's all over town. Like, it is embarrassing. Like, I was so sad when I left because all these places just opened right when I was.
Yeah, when we left Portland, a bunch of new places opened up too, and like we're expanding. And it's funny because I'll talk to some of my friends back in Portland about places that I miss eating at, and they'll be like, "Oh, we don't even eat there anymore." It's like they're like, we've got this, and this," and I'm just like, "What?" It's amazing. Bloomington too has a vegan bakery like that's literally across the street from the last like big straight edge house that we all lived in. And and we were like, man, if that bakery existed when we when we lived in that house, it would have been terrible. But I know. But yeah, in San Diego, we got a lot for you now too. So next time you have a conference here, I'll make sure you you find every place.
And dude, I had never been to Portland, and so it's really funny. All my bands, like from Black God, Black Cross, all the bands before that, and I had never been to Oregon. So we went there for a conference last year, right before COVID broke out, and I mean, that place was ridiculous. Like, every block a vegan restaurant. Went to Vitopia, that cheese place. So it was amazing. Like, went to a little dim sum place, or a little noodle place or dumpling shop in the back of that. Like, we were just like, it was, it was insane. And this is strange too. So I've always loved like one of my, if you think about kind of top 5, top 10 bands, like I love Drive Like Jehu, Hot Snakes, all the iterations. I'd never seen the Hot Snakes. So we're in this conference, and I see an old friend of mine, and I'm like, wait a minute. And he's like, oh, I was like, what are you doing tonight? We were eating. He's like, oh, I'm going to see Hot Snakes at some random indie motorcycle show. And I was like, what? It was the best week of my life. It's like, I just kept eating, and then suddenly randomly Hot Snakes is playing. I'm like, gonna go see Hot Snakes. And it was like some biker show. So it was like maybe only like 150, 200 people in this room. So you're right up front. Like, it was just like the best week ever. And I probably
You get to eat a homegrown smoker while you were there, the vegan barbecue. Yeah.
I will say it's a special treat when I'm out of town. You know, I'm less and less interested in kind of like barbecue kind of fake meats as much. Like I love a good like uh pho or like super awesome Southern Indian food, or like I like trying to figure out, such I've been in such restricted towns, but like going to a different cuisine that I haven't had that has great vegan stuff. But yeah, it's good every now and then. You always just feel like you can't poop for a week. You're like, oh, after you eat it, you're like, I'm gonna but it's
We
delicious.
we have vegan Indian. We have in San Diego. We have two. We have a vegan sushi place. We have recently a fancy pants Japanese vegan Japanese. We have a Cafe Gratitude. We have two native foods. We're doing all right here,
It's
but
kind of attitude the where was so Ryan Patterson
mhm.
went to a restaurant there, I believe, and they had like a Cat Magic Punks kind of like one-off thing there, and like the whole menu was themed. But he said it was like amazing. It was
Kindred. That's what I was gonna get to. Yeah, their brunch is amazing. The pancakes are insane. That's my birthday spot. Yeah, they had and they always play like stoner metal, like all day long on a loop while you're there. It's great.
also
Um,
you eat more slowly. You're like da da da.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, we were in there one time. They were playing Danzig, and I was like, I think you're pushing it there, but I appreciate the Danzig. But they're great, and they have like a black metal, a big picture of the guy from Immortal with the cat in one of the bathrooms. That place is fantastic. But we also have here our favorite place in San Diego is we have an all vegan Thai place.
Oh,
And once you have an amazing gourmet, entirely vegan Thai place, you feel like you'll never be the same again. Again, because um, we
yeah.
used to live very close to it, and like anytime we wanted to carry out, it was always veganic. To the point where when I would dial them, they would say hello, David, and I felt very weird about that. But at the same time, I was like, I don't care because I'm eating veganic all the time, and they have cream cheese wontons that I'm promising you if you ever come here for a conference.
That's like 1980s stuff. Like I haven't had a cream cheese wonton since I was probably 12 years old with my parents eating at the Oriental House in Kentucky.
Yeah, yeah. Well, veganic is to me it's my favorite place in San Diego, but we're pretty lucky because it's funny when we lived in San Diego, went to Portland, came back, and the amount of vegan stuff that increased like while we were gone wasn't that much, but since we've been back, we've just been watching it grow. And we even have what's cool is one of the non-public schools for kids with disabilities in town is a place called Stein, and there's a random convenience store around the corner from Stein that the guy who ran the convenience store became vegan and then turned it into like he has a sandwich shop in the back and he runs this convenience store as a vegan convenience store. And it was funny because every time we get staff over from Stein that moved to our school, whenever I say I'm vegan, they always ask me like, "Oh, have you been to this store? It's great." And I realize how many people who are just people in the neighborhood eat at that place because
It's
you
delicious.
know it's delicious and awesome. And but it's totally the other side of San Diego, and I get everywhere on bike, so I've only been there like twice.
Yeah.
But I hear it's great. And they just got lots of really good stuff going on. So, Rob, this was awesome. I had a lot of fun reminiscing about the old days and getting into some restaurants. But are you are you still doing Black Cross when you can get back to Louisville? Are you still doing music, or do you? I know you, by the grace of God, is off and on doing stuff, right?
Yeah, so I don't know if you know. So Black Cross ended about 10 years before, and well, then Black God was the last iteration of that. So we
Oh, okay. Yeah, I did not know that. I thought Black Cross was.
on a little 7-inch thing. So that's kind of done. And then Duncan and I, we put out a record right before I moved here, and then we, we talk about writing more songs. So we just like being together, all of us, Tommy and Tree and all those folks. It's just a wonderful group of guys. But I just started a band here called Jupiter Hearts. We haven't recorded anything yet. We've got about 8 or 9 songs, and it's funny. My department chair plays guitar and used to book shows in like Kalamazoo in the late '80s, and so he was kind of playing in a cover band, and I was like, "You ever listen to punk or something like?" He's like, "Oh yeah," and I was like, "Wait a minute!" And so he had this great writing songs, and I was like, "I don't know," because he's played covers, but he's incredible, and he writes these awesome songs with great. I don't know, it's really fun. And then there was a guy that saw Endpoint in Europe in '92, and by the grace of God, '97, and he lives here, and he's like, "Oh yeah," it's still heavy German accent. He's like, "I play bass," and so he joined us. And then there's a wonderful record store here called Lunchbox, and the owner of that plays drums, Scott Wishart. So he's playing. So we just started playing, and
That's awesome.
it's been really fun. So I don't know if anything will come out of it, but at least I get to keep doing something that I really enjoy, and it gives me a little balance between the other work things.
Yeah, well, and I love some of the projects that like Carl from EC has a punk band that he's doing, Apocalypse Tribe, and I love that he's doing a punk band that he's never done a straight punk band before, and I just think it's so cool. But and some of the fun things that are going on with that, I think that's really neat that you're doing new music, and I really look forward to hearing it. Um, Rob, it was awesome talking to you about these things. I think people will really enjoy catching up with you and what you're doing and hearing. I know not everybody. Some people are going to tune in for the educational stuff, and some people are going to tune in for the hardcore stuff. For the people that listen to all of it, I really appreciate your time. This has been really fun for me. Endpoint, like I said, just in a lot of ways, the soundtrack of my high school years because I went to boarding school, which was kind of weird outside of in Carbondale, and so for me to travel to get to all the shows that I did was a huge hardship for me, and I always appreciated like just the emotional outpouring of Endpoint was something that is just a huge part of my childhood. And I know that sounds kind of goofy and weird to say, my young adulthood, but I just really appreciate that. I also appreciate that you and Duncan are out there as educators. Is a really neat thing for me, and I'm really excited for more by the grace of God too. So I'm going to put it out there. I want you to do more.
Yeah. So I'm going to reciprocate by saying, one, when I think of all these towns that I visited in those days, right? Those days, as you said, they were emotional. They were so seminal or foundational almost for who I was, who I've become. But there are faces associated with all of these towns during that time, and you're one of those faces. And I'm not surprised that you're a writer. You keep pumping out these books. Like there are all the people that seem to be those kind of like, oh, the people that I know that were working so hard and so engaged during our time, they're all doing great things. I mean,
yeah, it's awesome. Like
organization, majority of them like crazy stuff. You're like, oh my God, of course you're doing this. Like I'm in the government. I've just made this change to increase. Yes, of course you did. I'm running this company to do this. I'm doing this type of work with this population. And I'm just never surprised because because that community, again, I know I'm being idealistic and overgeneralized, which is so full of so many hardworking and talented and kind people. So it's been a pleasure for me to catch up with you and just and I hope we do it again.
Yeah. I agree, and I hope you can make it out here to San Diego for a conference, and then we'll do it over veganic or something.
I have high expectations now. When I'm coming there, you're gonna be like, "Oh God, Rob's calling." I'm like, "No, where are we going?"
So, yeah, where are we going? We'll do well, but I know what you're saying though too, because I had the experience of kind of experiencing living in 2 hardcore scenes because I went to school in Syracuse and did that whole thing, and specifically in Syracuse, so many of those kids have awesome businesses now from Syracuse, like specifically that town. And then you have like Shane Durkee, who's running an art gallery, and like it just the cool stuff that the kids from Syracuse do. Lori, who's like a master of yoga, and like, you know, from that hardcore scene, it's just incredible just to see people come out of that. So I have the weird thing where I have all my Indiana friends where I feel like they did cool stuff, like Ian Phillips running 3 Carrots, and you know, for
Oh my God.
example,
Restaurant. Hold on, that's a good one. That's a great one. So
yes,
we're just quick advertising, you know, because again, Indianapolis, you go there and you're like, the food's okay. Never excited about going to Indy to eat, but now with 3 Carrots, delicious.
yeah,
Love.
I was roommates with Ian for a while, so I had him. I was like in his kitchen with him cooking for years, so I have a strong place in my heart. And so you can always look at 3 Carrots too and say X Birthright, X Horizon, you know, X Rise Overrun, and it's like one of those cool things. But yeah, see, we could go on forever. Anyways, Rob, it was really awesome talking to you and catching up with you. It's really cool to see what you're doing. So I hope listeners, I'll put an Endpoint song at the end of this bad boy, so they can hear a little bit of it, because but definitely go and check out the YouTube videos of old Endpoint live shows to get a feel for what we're talking about. It's just it was a phenomenal time and place. So thank you, Rob.
Take it easy.